Thank you, Detroit Champions for Hope. I am hopeful that you found both the video and all the proceedings up to this point informative and impactful to your thinking as you move forward in your advocacy efforts and in your efforts in our community. We wanted to close our time with you today with what I believe is a very powerful session around resilience of community, resilience of families in the face of adversity. And so I am honored to have two dynamic people with me today, Dr. Wendy Ellis and Dr. Ijeoma Eruka, who are joining me for a final session of the day. I've been looking so forward to spending time with these two amazing leaders, what I'm calling scientists of human development and interaction, for an exploration with you about how historically marginalized communities move from adeptly coping to truly thriving. What I'm hoping for us to begin unpacking is how we as a community, a society, might move closer to the desired state of equitable data use, research, policy creation, and practice to close opportunity gaps. I'm going to begin with a question to Dr. Ellis, but first let me tell you a little bit about her. Dr. Ellis is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Health and director of the Center for Community Resilience at the Millikan Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. The Building Community Resilience Collaborative and networks are implementing the BCR process, which is a strategic approach for cross-sector partners to align resources, programs, and initiatives with community-based efforts to address adverse childhood experiences and adverse community environments, or as Dr. Ellis has coined it, the pair of ACEs. Thank you for being with us, Wendy. How have or are systems and policies perpetuating the existing divide of wealth and power?
Well, before I dive into answering that question, I would be remiss in not at least comment on that video, that very powerful video that you had to start us off here on this conversation. And yes, it is absolutely important for us to vote, but it is also important for us to continue to hold our politicians and leaders accountable. Democracy is a process, it is not an event. And so when we participate in the process of voting, we also have to continue to participate in the process of implementation and holding us accountable in our systems. And that really is a great preview to talking about how we look at power and structures through the pair of ACEs lenses. So this is a simple graphic that I created about 4 years ago to really help our communities as well as our stakeholders understand that it's not just what's happening to individuals, but it's the context. It's thinking about what's in the soil that drives these outcomes. So the adverse childhood experiences is a body of science that is based upon understanding that early adversity, exposure to early adversity in childhood can lead to and set our children on a pathway of destruction, sometimes self-destruction. Meaning that if you have a mother who is experiencing maternal depression or a father who has been incarcerated early in your childhood, or divorce or mental illness in the household, that this actually sets you up for higher risk for things like an early onset of behavioral disorders or learning disorders or onset of mental illness yourself. It's tied to obesity, it's tied to heart disease, it's tied to diabetes, many things that disproportionately impact communities of color. But these things do not happen in isolation. These things are often commingled with the nutrients that are in our soil. So when we think about poverty, discrimination, community disruption, the lack of opportunity, the lack of access to economic mobility, you can begin to see how adverse experiences by individuals can be exacerbated by that community environment. how those leaves and branches reflect what's in the soil. So if we go to the next slide, you can see how, particularly in COVID-19, that those things that were in our soil have only exacerbated what's being felt at the community level, whether that's housing instability, the lack of access to primary care and screening, unemployment at record levels, unemployment disproportionately impact community of color. And guess what? Because of those activities that I talked about on the first screen, that set us up for a higher risk for chronic disease. We're also seeing higher rates of risk factors and mortality to chronic disease. And so you can begin to see how inequity, systemic inequity, has driven and been exacerbated, not just by these longstanding inequities, but certainly by COVID-19. The virus is unseen, but its impact is quite measurable and quite in our communities. And so why is that? Well, let's go to the next screen where we talk about this work to understand the root cause of inequity and trauma. We will cast an important vote in 2020, but let us not be fooled that by one election, we can begin to erase and address the systemic racism and white supremacy that has been empowered by 600 years of policy. So I use this policy timeline to help us understand when we look at inequity in our community, particularly in the Detroit area, when we look at the disproportionality of, say, things like household wealth. Well, we can understand in Detroit, if you just look at the middle of that line, the New Deal housing initiatives, we had a great migrant African Americans coming up to work in the factory of Detroit and reach the middle class. Today in 2020, we have a great disparity of household wealth. And why is that? It's because from the very beginning, we were excluded from the opportunity to build household wealth by being able to buy property, by being able to access federally guaranteed mortgages. And what is the way of passing on generational wealth in this country? It is through passing on of real estate. And so you can begin to see by just looking at one policy, how the ripple effect that today is exacerbated by something like COVID-19. But it is just one example of many policies enacted, many practices put in place, where policy was used as an instrument of white supremacy to ensure white supremacy as an outcome. This is why our vote in 2020 counts. So if you go to the last screen, I do want to make a clarification here and a full understanding that when we talk about white supremacy and what has been on display here in 2020, let us not be distracted by the white sheets or the tiki torches. I actually am quite less interested in individual belief, but I want us to understand that when we talk about white supremacy as a public health crisis, as something that we do have to address, not only in the voting booth, but also in the enactment of legislation and how our leaders act on our behalf. It is because white supremacy as a belief is what is the foundation of structural racism. The systems and the policies designed to empower white supremacist belief. And what does that do? It produces white supremacy as an outcome. That white people dominate in power, health, wealth, and well-being. These are the difficult truths that we must face, difficult conversations that we must have, but understanding that our opportunity here in 2020 is not just we will cast, is not just the outcome of this election, but it is how we will use advocacy, our voice, and our communities to hold systems accountable for change. Thank you.
Denise, you're muted.
Now I'd
Denise,
like
you're on
to,
mute.
can you hear me now? You should be
Yes.
hearing me.
Yes.
Now I'd like to bring Dr. Iruka into the conversation. Dr. Aruka is the newly appointed research professor in public policy and director of early childhood health and racial equity at UNC Chapel Hill, where she will focus on early childhood health and racial equity. Her former posts include Child Research Officer for High Scope Educational Research Foundation, Director of Research and Evaluation at the Buffett Early Childhood Institute at the University of Nebraska, and Associate Director at the FPG Child Development Institute at UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Aruka Iyoma, Ta-Nehisi Coates states in his book, Between the World and Me, race is the child of racism, not the father. And the process of naming the people has never been a matter of genealogy and physiognomy or appearance, so much as one of hierarchy. I'd like for you to share with us how these ideals of race inferiority and those who hold them affect how children in marginalized communities see themselves and internalize their capacity to learn.
Ooh, that's a big old question, and I just want to first obviously thank everybody, and thank you, Denise and Wendy. Just put a slap down with just her few comments, and just want to sort of say to that question that, again, talking about sort of any issues about racial inferiority is, let's literally look at the system, right? And I think Wendy really articulated well that part of the system is we have to take this sort of much more of a longer arc to it and look at the life course. So here is sort of one of the framework that comes from public health. That we need to not just examine what's happening today, and I think as Wendy articulated earlier, what happened before today, right? And that means, for example, we have to look at the political sort of things that happened. I think an earlier conversation around TANF, decisions made about how money is used has implications for whether we have childcare providers that are paid at the highest level, whether children are experiencing high quality learning, and then what disparities come, right? So we have to sort of look at all these things in both from a macroeconomic political context to the socioeconomic position of families to then what happens to children. Next slide, please. And I think this idea of racial inferiority is something that actually infuriates me. Because if it's like we were so inferior, why are we using our bodies, our brains, and all these assets we have to build the United States of America, even till today, right? So we know obviously examples from the Tuskegee syphilis study, and we have so many other examples. If we look at early childhood in this contemporary form started with primarily Black children. As a former research officer at High Scope, known for the preschool study, it was primarily Black children. I'm at UNC again, the Abecedarian study, again, primarily Black children. So you cannot build these amazing, innovative programs and policies and services on the backs of those you think are inferior. I think this is where we're always challenged, sort of this sort of dichotomy of you're not good enough, but we need you to create something that's going to benefit not Black people in particular, or other marginalized communities, but to benefit everybody else. And so I think this idea is what keeps percolating, next slide please, around sort of the notion of eugenics. And so I think for us, and I'm gonna speak much more to my early childhood community, is that in many ways, while we think of eugenics as something that happened with the Nazis and to maintain white supremacy, it is a lot of what we do, especially within the early child space, is often saying, oh, sadly, Black children in particular and brown children, you are not meeting up to the standards of whiteness, right? That is literally a lot of our markers, right? When it comes to our quality standards, quality based from whose point of view, and it's primarily been based on a point of view of white majority people. And so again, while eugenics may not be the words we use, but our actions, our policies, our programming, our standards, our expectations are literally formed under the disguise of white supremacy and under the disguise of eugenics, that Black people in particular and brown people are never going to meet that standard that's called, whiteness or being white. And so I think this is part of the challenge that we have to continue to sort of lean into, is that if we're trying to be different, then we actually have to do different. And what we're doing now, sometimes we have to question, do we really want things to change, right? Again, I'll harpen back to the TANF conversation. Why is it that money that really is for needy families being repurposed in particular ways that may not benefit those who need it? So for example, we know right now that the tax code as currently constructed will literally take money from Black people and brown people. We know college education in many ways does not confer the same outcomes for Black people in particular. So there are many things that we're doing under the sort of universal racial blindness that I think will often come to harm us. Again, whether it's on purpose or not, I don't know, but I guess if I look at Wendy's slides, I would say there's some purpose to that. And we have to sort of attend to the intentionality of, particularly, I say, follow the dollars. If you follow the dollars, if it's not following those who need it the most, then we have to ask ourselves, are politicians and policymakers and those who are leaders doing it for us, or are they doing it just without us? I think we have to really have these hard conversations. Next slide. And I'm hoping we can actually hear the sound from the video, because I think we have to understand that what happens with adults and systems does have implications for what happens with children. So I'm just going to play a quick video of 2 minutes. Are you able to play it and hear sound?
Qual è quella brutta? E qual è quella buona? Quale è cattiva? Qual è buona? Perché è buona?
Perché ha gli occhi celesti.
Quale è cattiva? Perché è cattiva?
Perché è tutto nero.
E qual è la bambola che ti somiglia di più? Quale bambola è nera?
Mi ha offeso.
Chi?
Tu.
Perché?
Perché mi hai chiamato nero.
Perché ti offendo?
Mi offendi perché altri bambini mi hanno offeso con cattiveria.
No, io non ho usato nessuna cattiveria.
Quello mi sta guardando storto.
I want to make sure that people understand that when we're talking about issues of racial inferiority, that while we're talking about the systems level, oh, Lynn's on mute, that's why. Okay, while we're talking about systems level, there are things that impact children directly. And so this video is literally the Italian version of the doll test. And if you remember the doll test from Clark and Clark, which basically showed children, young children, who are basically saying, here's a brown doll, brown, black looking doll, here's a white looking doll. And they ask them the question of, who's the good doll? Who's the bad doll? Who's the pretty doll? Who's the ugly doll? Who is the nice doll? Who is the not? And who's the smart, etc. And you see sort of the same pattern, no matter where we go globally, where children particularly are always saying that the black, brown looking doll is not the prettiest, not the smartest, not the nicest, all the negative connotations. And we're talking about 4 and 5-year-olds, and it's a global phenomenon. And what you don't see, and when you get the link, what you should see is the eyes of children. When you ask black and brown children, so which doll do you look like? There we go. Okay, which doll do you look like? And to see their eyes sort of say, I look like the doll I just called as not pretty, not nice, not smart. That is the impact of racism on children's own identity about who and what their worth is. And so we have to recognize the impact of the system on children in many ways. Are we able to hear the video? If not,
I don't think we are, but
Yeah.
it is extremely impactful. And I ask you to make sure that you do listen to it and watch it when you see it. I mean, I'm getting chills just reliving it as Ioma is narrating, the way the children respond. It's a must see.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, please see the video. Okay. Okay, you could just go, yeah, you could, yeah. So I just want to sort of just, again, just highlight that while we're still doing studies around the impact of racism directly on children, that we know that race-based trauma stress presents with a variety of symptoms that have lifelong consequences, whether it's intense fear, helplessness, re-experiencing the event. And Black children, Black youth in particular, are vulnerable to racial trauma because they don't have the cognitive sort of sophisticated understanding or the language with which to process. So this is why we have this issue where children know that something is unfair. They know they're being mistreated because of their skin color, but they don't know how to say, I'm being biased against. They don't have those words. And so we know by age 3, children know themselves in racial ethnic terms based on what society thinks of them. So skin color actually begins to matter early. However, adults don't even acknowledge it until kids are much older. And this is part of the problem of where if we continue to just focus on this color blindness or just say that everything white is great, and we don't acknowledge the oppression, the pain the children are experiencing in our own environments that's supposed to be affirming, then we are actually in many ways creating a level of trauma and a level of oppression because we're forcing children to perform in an environment that does not actually value who they are. So again, I just want to sort of stress that part. And you could just go ahead, Denise, thank you. We can talk about that later.
We can move on to the next one,
Yeah.
too. So I think if we were to begin to unpack, how do we overcome or right these wrongs? We are given, especially lately, the response of we need more equitable conditions or equitable approaches. But let's start first with what is equity? Ioma.
Oh man, if I could just stop
slide.
using Next time, if I could just stop using equity sometimes, I feel like equity has been completely taken over, right? I personally prefer racial equity. I think while yes, there's a lot of inequities, right? Let's define equity just in terms of, and I'll use the Robert Wood Johnson, Paula Braidman version, right? The equity really is about everyone has a fair and just opportunity to thrive and reach their potential. And also we have to remove barriers. So there's one thing to say, oh, here's your opportunity, good luck. No, you have to give that to me, right? The opportunity, and you have to remove all the obstacles contemporarily and historically. That's the part we always forget is that, oh, hey guys, now that you're here, let's go ahead and start over. You can't do do-overs with wealth, right? Wealth is something that literally just generated over time and over generations. You can't give me a do-over if you never allowed me to own property, if you never allowed me to go to, get schooling. So to me, this idea of equity needs to think about both of those set of things. And the reason why I often say, next slide, please, that I tend to sort of think about racial equity as kind of the larger looming thing that we have to sort of stay focused on is because even if we overlay issues of urbanicity versus rural, or children with disabilities, or language, or any other identity or demographics, if you put race over that, children who are Black and who speak a different language, children who are Black and poor, children who, so to me, I think we have to begin to say, let's not keep trying to sort of hide ourselves in the racism of the country and sort of throw everything in the kitchen sink inside of the equity, but to let's laser focus on, let's at least underscore and bold that we have a racism problem. And then when we figure that part out, I imagine that all these other inequities will be better attended to. And so again, I stress this notion of while we use equity sort of as everything and we confuse it with equality, I would stress that it's better for us to think through the racial equity lens. Next slide, click to the next slide. Oh, sorry, I thought we flipped it. Okay, no, I thought it was the other slide. So no. So I just want to say that I think that we just have to make sure that, thank you, that we really hone in on racial equity as part of the much larger part of the umbrella, as opposed to trying to put equity into everything that conflates everything. If you conflate everything, you never address the elephant in the room.
Thank you. I'll skip over to that other slide. Yep, right here. Wendy, why does it matter though? Why should, I hear Ioma starting to tease this out, but I want you to go a little bit deeper. What's equity got to do with it?
Well, as that policy timeline that I showed you earlier shows, there's an intentionality for that. We have a system that was designed for inequity. The intentionality was racial oppression, subjugation. And with case of the Native Americans, it was actually eradication was the intentionality. And so if we do not recognize the racial intent that built into our system, we cannot get to making ourselves whole. And so if you look at that logo that I have there in the middle, I use that to help people understand that inequity drives the trauma, drives the impact that we see. And that if we think we can get to resilience and healing without observing what and honoring the inequity and addressing it, we will never get there. So equity has everything to do with it. As my sister, I play off of Tina Turner all the time when I present this. It's like, what's equity got to do with it? It's everything. So when I listen to Ioma speak, one of the things that is really powerful about that video, the doll test, is that there's a global phenomenon of racism and supremacy that is the most measurable vestige of colonialism. And colonialism was about subjugating individuals that were in the countries, the First Nations, extracting every resource from those individuals and from those cultures and from those lands for profit, for the profit of the white plunderers. And so, no, it's no wonder that you can go to any of these countries where you either were colonized or you were the colonists. Mm. And this was their way of justifying their ability to reap all of the benefits from, say, taking of Spain taking of Latin American countries and the Caribbean, of coming to our shores here and wiping out nations to plunder and for economic interest. And so without having that, those really tough conversations and confronting our history, because it is our history, whether you were subjugated or whether you were it is all of our histories, and we got to own it. And so, to be able to lean into the first trauma, which is racial trauma, I agree with Ioma. That's absolutely the first job that we have to do. But I also am, when it comes to working in the policy and advocacy realm, to understand that it is important to remember equity can be measured along a number of different lines. And if we are talking about truly dismantling systems, we have to understand, because what was the original intent of inequity? Mm. It was all about capitalist gain. So ultimately, inequity was built on green or gold. And so what is the driver, the intent? Yes, the intent was to subjugate people of color, but to what end? And so we have to remember what to was about, because if we're going to successfully dismantle white supremacy, we have to remember what the to what end is about. And so if we're going to be successful with lawmakers on Capitol Hill, and we're going to talk about having a full-on assault to dismantle white supremacy and reconstruct, then there has to be a tough conversation and an understanding of to what end. And that is an equitable distribution of the resources for individuals of color, not just for people that are the majority or of the power class, I will say. So that's where, for my work, it is really understanding what are those systems, what are those policies that are intentionally put in place to drive the community characteristics that we see and the public health outcomes that we measure. That's going to measure equity. It's not a race, but it is going to be extremely important that we make sure that we're measuring equity by access to economic mobility, access to quality education, access to quality healthcare, how we police our neighborhoods, who's being policed, who has access to, say, prosecutorial discretion. Those things are the policies that help us understand, are we moving towards an equitable society? So yeah, we're going to have to widen our lens much more broadly than just race itself, but understand when we look at those policies, how are races being differentially impacted by those policies? So I hear you with the racial lens, but at the end of the day, our systems, the reality is our systems are going to do, they are programmed to do, and what they're measured as far as these performance outcomes are concerned. And the performance outcomes aren't about race. The performance outcomes are about all those indicators that I indicated. So that's when you have to get under the machine and say, okay, so what is driving that we have disproportionately more African-American men going to prison? It is how those policies are carried out. It's how we police differentially in lower income neighborhoods, how we police differentially for individuals of color. That's where the race plays in, but the policy is the same. And there's a different motivating factor for the policies. So it is a much more complicated and by design complicated system to drive these inequitable outcomes. And this is why I said democracy is not an event. It is a long-term process. And that timeline is meant to show us that we have 600 years of policy that has to be undone. And the difference between what's happened here in the US, as far as equity is concerned, versus other countries, is that we've been colonized consistently by the same force for 600 years. Let that sink in. That's so different than some of the other countries. That is so different. Yeah.
And I'll just add, I know
And I'm not,
questions. I know
Well, I'm going to skip to our last question because we're all almost out of time, but go ahead, Ioma.
No, I was just gonna add, I think, Wendy, right, you make a great point about expanding sort of the notion and looking at sort of what was the purpose of creating such sort of inequities in the system. And I would say, obviously, when we think about young children, we know a lot of systems in interface with them, right? In the first few years of life, we understand that we need to look at all the systems that's going to impact them. But we already know that a lot of our data already shows us there's already racial differences before children get here, and then as they go through the life course. And so for me, I think it's really important to, exactly to your point of why we continue to think about all the different inequities, that if we literally I can literally close my eyes and say, these children, we know what's going to happen from before you're born. And I think even the issues of climate justice impacts us. Every single issue impacts many minoritized communities, that we sort of have to sort of pay attention to those kind of racial markers, because we know in the end of it, whether it's for a different purpose, the outcome of racial disparities are still there. And I think that's something that we have to continue to push on, is what do we do about these issues in a way that I think is exactly systemic, but also thinks about the life course and also globally. So I really appreciate your comments.
So in our last 3 minutes.
And I appreciate you bringing up the, can I just follow up here? Because you make such a key point by bringing up the child welfare, because it is not about the child, nor is it about the welfare, particularly of children of color. And the motivating factor for most of our child welfare systems is the disruption of families. And that's how they are rewarded. And so how do we change the reward? And this is why I say it's so important to go way upstream and understand what is the motivation behind the policy and what is the economic motivation there. There's more economy in actually disrupting families, because there's money to be made in that particular process, than it is to actually reunify our families, keep our families together. So this is where I'm talking about systems change. It's like, no, wait a minute, hold up. Why are we disrupting families? Why aren't we actually incentivizing holding our families together? Why aren't we incentivizing actually supporting parents so that they can keep a stable household? That's what the systems change piece is about. And that's why I say when we're talking about equity, we can't just look at race. We have to look at green. We are in a system of capitalism that everything is going to be motivated by money. And so we've been monetized, and it's been incentivized to monetize our inequity. So we have to change the motivation so that actually the monetization is equity.
Okay, we now only have 2 minutes left, so that's okay. I just want to take us back to our very beginning. We're going to skip all of those. Let's just go to the end. And let me ask the question to both of you. You have 1 minute to respond. Offer us at least one principle to which we need to attend in order to create racially and culturally affirming villages or supportive communities that focus on protection, affection, and connection.
So I will go first, and then Wendy could take the banner after that. I would say actually it's not really one, but I would say exactly the banner you just put up, which is around that. To me, what we have to do is actually that fullness of protection, affection, correction, and connection. And that has been something that colleagues both at UNC and then Howard Stevenson UPenn have really pulled together to say that for us to get to what children need, right? We're talking about children who have been minoritized, who have been oppressed, that we have to think about how do we protect them from the psychological trauma, poverty, inequities, racism, all of those things. But then at the same time, how do we also show affection, right? It's not about poverty in of itself or racism, but it's how do we also affirm who they are as people, as individuals, as children. So affection is important. And then how do we correct children, right? We focus on punishment as sort of our mechanism, as opposed to, I think, as Wendy said earlier, incentivizing, your best self. And I would say finally, it's about connection, right? We all have to ensure that children in particular understand that they belong in the spaces, whether or not we want them there, that we have to show their uniqueness, their value, their importance, that their skin color should not be monetized for negativity, but their skin color should be a place of affirmation. And so for me, it's not one word, but it's that collection of protection, affection, correction, and connection.
Thank you. Wendy?
Well, let's not pretend that children exist in isolation of their families and of their communities. And I think the most important thing that we can do is, if we are looking at how do we best children, the question is, how are we best supporting our parents? How are we best supporting the communities in which the parents are trying to thrive? And so you made the point earlier about removing barriers. Let's take the boot off the necks of our parents in these situations. Not every parent has had an ideal childhood. Let's not further, hurt the parent because of what they may have experienced in the past. Let's instead help to do a 2-generational model where we're actually healing parents so that they can support their children and thrive. This is not just going to be something that we do in schools and say, okay, we've given this great model for our kids and support them, and we've got screening for them and what have you, and then we send them out into back home. Parents aren't supported. They still are dealing with the same stressors. It is a holistic model. That is how we will best produce our healthy, ready, and able children ready to learn and ready to compete, is if we're actually supporting the parents as well as the community they are in. That's what equity looks like.
Thank you. I'm going to take one question that's in our box of questions to close us out. I'm so sorry to everyone. I know I'm sorry myself to not be able to spend more time with them. And I see from all the chats that you wish you had more time. So we'll be sure to bring these ladies back. I told you from the beginning it was going to be powerful. But the one question that I do want to honor that's in our box currently is asking, how will we keep our local representatives accountable to the early childhood community? What are our next action steps? Either one of you.
So, yeah, I can take that. And actually, I have an entire guide on our website that's free to download, but it is constant advocacy. It is constant putting the feet to the fire. When there are appropriations, when there's opportunities for funding, making sure that our voices are heard, making sure that we will hold them accountable for that. That's what makes the difference. The squeaky wheel is the one that gets the oil. And that certainly is true when it comes to holding our systems accountable. And so I cannot stress this enough. It is a process, an ongoing process. And, whether it is advocacy at your school level, where you're constantly in that principal's office and you're making sure that they are allocating funds and resources to the children who need it, whether it's at the school district level, whether it's at city council level, state representative, and even up to the federal level. We have to constantly use our voices. And when our voices aren't heard, we make our voices heard by our choices at the ballot box. This is how democracy works, and that's how we're going to make the difference.
And I would just add, I would just add briefly, and I would say, I think exactly to what Wendy said, I do also think that we ourselves have to actually also hold ourselves accountable as adults, which may mean that you become the policymaker. I think that to sort of expect somebody to carry your water is something that we know doesn't always work. Even when you vote somebody in, you hope that they'll do what they promise. But again, some of us live it and some of us just read it. So I think I would encourage us to begin to look next to us, look around us and say, who can actually be that policymaker, and not put this imaginary person forward, put yourself forward as part of the solution. And so again, I cannot say thank you enough to Wendy, to Denise, and all of you guys who are really doing this hard work.
Well, thank you once again for all of us for being here today and for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, both with others and your own personal stories that I know are embedded in a lot of what you believe in and why you're so passionate about it. So thank you for being with us today. So we're going to transition to our close. I know we could have been here much, much longer, and I greatly appreciate everyone for the time they've taken today. First, let me thank you as audience for sitting at this table, for actively participating. I challenge you to continue raising your voice and building your advocacy muscle towards creating the system we need for building brains and building futures, to ensure that our children are born healthy, developing appropriately, and provided the opportunities to become independent, critical thinkers, successful in school and life. I'm going to encourage you to vote in the upcoming elections for officials willing to have you sit at decision tables, and continue to promote those to office who represent you in all ways, and to advocate for policies that provide access, make sure that we can afford the services that are needed and that they are of high quality. Finally, I'm going to ask you to share your feedback on this event in a survey, which you'll receive in our thank you for attending follow-up email, and by completing the pledge card that you receive by snail mail over the next couple of weeks, along with a token of our appreciation. Now, because all of you are really critical pieces of the puzzle that we must solve for a brighter future for young children and families, I'm asking you to complete your puzzle piece, which you'll receive in the mail. Snap a picture of you holding it, upload it, and tag us on Twitter at #HopeBuilds or on Instagram. As you can see, I've completed with mine, but I am a system agitator, and I am committing to vote, to meet with legislators, and to continue to elevate the needs of Detroit's youngest citizens. So before closing, let me thank my sponsors. Thank you. W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Kresge Foundations, Pritzker's Children Initiative, and IFF. I'd like to also give a special thanks to my team, to the outstanding planning team that supported us in putting all of this together, to Detroit Champions for Hope, all of the Hope Starts Here imperatives, and the event support team, including Special D, Detroit Public Television, and 360 Interactive. And I'd like to leave you with this final quote from Nelson Mandela. Action without vision is only passing time. Vision without action is merely daydreaming, but vision with action can change the world. Thank you for being with us today.